councillor, I'm quite visible. I'm in all the local environment groups. I go regularly to their meetings, I go to all the forums, and I do all the grunt work with the local government. Yet, they will still go to the Labor Party to do media stuff because they see the Labor Party as having more power than the Greens. All the community knows I'm there working, etc. But it really is frustrating that they still think that Labor's going to do it.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm running as the Greens candidate in Newtown for the state election next year. Adam, I wanted to go back to 2007 when you were running against Lindsay Tanner and I was running against Tanya Plibersek in Melbourne and Sydney for the federal election, and we used to use the line that said not only do we need to get rid of Howard, but we also need to get rid of the Howard government agenda. And I think that one of the things that I feel like we look back and reflect on is that we, in a sense, failed to do that. And so the kind of worry that I have about this kind of talk and the worry I have about what happened when we got the balance of power is that we basically put our faith back in the Parliament to be able to solve all of these problems for us. And I wonder if you might want to comment a little bit on that, coming from a place where we used to say that, where we used to be in that space, but also then knowing that we achieved a massive amount of gains while we had the balance of power, but then we risk the idea of people thinking that Parliament is how we're going to solve these social problems, and environmental problems. So I wonder if you want to comment a bit on that, and then I also want to put it to what does radical parliamentary action look like?
How do we manage to, I guess, be seen as a genuine pole of attraction? How can we really cohere and lead? And the thing which conspires against it, I've got some people I count as dear comrades in the ALP. I've got some people I've worked with in the ALP who I would happily run down in a truck, fire truck. But that's not the point. It's not about the ALP. I think it's actually something far deeper, which is that sense where people want someone to do it for them. The reason why people sort of end up going back to the major parties because they are the major party. I see it in my union where, in spite of the argument, like we consciously try to say to every firefighter, look, you are the union. We've got 100% density. At one level, every firefighter is the union. But at the same time, there's a significant minority of people who will say to me or other elected officials, people often say, fix it. It's your job to fix it. Just can you make it go away? Can you do what needs to be done? And it comes, I think, with a lack of confidence. The people just don't think that they can change the world. They don't think that what they do matters. And in that situation, you inevitably start to try to find someone to fix it for you. How do you get around that? I think what we do is we take the areas where we know we can actually get some kind of traction and some kind of result, and we pour resources into it. At the moment, I think the campaign around a coal is a very good example of that. There's two reasons for that. One is because in and of itself, campaigns that win are a good thing. But the other, more importantly, I think, anyone who goes through that experience, anyone who actually tastes their own power, their own collective power, it starts to change that dynamic. And rather than looking for someone to sort it out for you, you start thinking about how can I do it myself? Now, if we are in the heart of that debate, that's how I think we start to tilt it.
I think that the people that vote for us are smart, and I think that the people who think about voting for us and then end up voting for someone else are also smart. And I think people in this country at this point in history are up for the discussion about how you affect change, and I think they understand that Labor and Liberal on so many of the things that matter are singing from the same song sheet, but they've got a pile of reservations about us that means that sometimes they don't come over and vote for us. I don't think those reservations are about, you were in balance of power and you used Parliament to get a couple of things but you didn't get some other things, or you worked with the Labor Party. I think the biggest challenge that we've got is not so much that. I think the biggest challenge that we've got is around, it's not our policies either, it's around communication of what we stand for and making people feel like they can engage with us and trust us. And part of the problem is that a lot of people haven't met someone from the Greens, they haven't seen Greens MPs in action in their local area, and so we're kind of in some ways on probation, but they're willing to give us the benefit of the doubt. But our biggest problem is communication. Like, our biggest challenge, I think, is to actually find systematic ways of going around the Murdoch media and even the Fairfax media, and actually communicating directly with the people who are thinking about voting for us. And then if we can find more untrammelled ways of communicating with people, then I think they're going to give us far more latitude to work together through those difficult times and make those difficult decisions. But it's about opening up those pipes that at the moment are closed. And so I'd say actually that's our primary thing.
Somebody did say to me, there was actually another question, was do you think, it was in the context of us grappling with this issue, is the weakness of the social movements these days? And the question was put to me, did I think that with getting Greens MPs elected, that people would think, oh, well, we've solved the problem, and that's partly why the movements are weak. I think it's an important conversation. I think it's more complex than that. But it's an interesting one to consider, because in many ways the objective conditions that we operate under as Greens, where there's virtually always an election on the rise, that's what we're working so hard to, is teaching people that it's all about Parliament. Now, I've got great respect for Parliament, more than I expected actually, because I never expected I'd be a politician. I think it's quite amazing what's been worked out in terms of how Parliament runs. But in terms of social change, we always need to remember it's one tool in terms of how you achieve that. The importance of social movements cannot be underestimated, and that's a huge challenge for the left. So when Jenny asked that important question, what does radical action look like today? I can't give a quick answer to that, but we are seeing it around us, like the fantastic actions at Laird Forest with the most creative direct actions that we've seen, and why we don't have the big social movements like what a lot of us grew up with in the 60s and 70s and 80s. They're in different forms, with the climate change movement being one of them, and I think that diversity of action is what is so critical. And finally, to Linda's question, what do you do locally at Canterbury when all the community go off to Labor? Something we face every day. You've just got to win your stripes, and you're winning your stripes, Linda. You just keep at it.
Tony Abbott's shown great skill in dividing Greens policy when he wants to. I was thinking of the petrol excise tax linked in with roads. When he bundles his legislation, he bundles it in a way that can be highly divisive. So I was delighted that Christine Milne addressed the Press Council, as you mentioned, said that she was interested in discussing direct action along with the RET. And the very conservative Financial Review came out and said, great, she's now in the room, she's now in the discussion room. I would thoroughly recommend that you look as hard as you can to use divisive tactics on Tony Abbott as well, and to divide his policies. Great.
Adam Bandt's election victory was obviously inspirational, but I think it would be a tragedy to draw the conclusion from that victory that it was a result of an efficient electoral machine, which is what Adam placed such emphasis on in his contribution. I think, Adam, you won because you stood for something. You stood for welcoming refugees into this country. You stood for clear links with the unions. You expressed your anger in class terms. You orientated on Labor voters. And you won against the stream. The Greens vote went down in that election. You were an aberration. I think there's a reason for that. I think obviously Jim Casey is correct when he says that we need a movement outside Parliament. Obviously we need that, but we have to be careful about that argument because it can be deployed for nefarious purposes. Explaining the decline of the Green vote in the election where Adam won against the Tide, Christine Milne said this was because there was a Conservative tide. There was a Conservative tide across Australia. Nothing about participation with the Labor government, nothing about linking the Greens to unpopular carbon tax, no reckoning in that sense, just this thing about a Conservative tide. And I'll finish on this point. I think Lee gets it correct when she says the question is it a sectarianism towards the Labor Party or capitulation? I think that is a question that is going to be posed more sharply for the Greens again and again, and I think Adam's campaign win shows that if you orientate on Labor Party voters, you can win them and mobilise them. That should be the orientation of Greens rather than cutting deals with Labor in Parliament.
Hi, I just wanted to follow on to what Adam Bandt was saying about the biggest challenge being communication. Would you say that the sort of coalition-formulated rhetoric of the left, whether that's Labor or Greens, as bad economic managers is particularly damaging to the Greens movement? And like, how would you combat that kind of perception? Because I think it's sort of heavily rooted in like this fear of higher taxes and anti-taxes and all that kind of thing, and how do you sort of reverse that perception?
it's absolutely right that our campaign in Melbourne was first and foremost a positive one that says we stand for something and here's what we stand for. We went out of our way to explain it. And our slogan that we sent everyone out a little brochure, and our slogan was Clean Economy, Caring Society. And it was about saying, look, actually, if you did all of these things, here's a vision of Australia and here's what it could look like. And I think you're right that it's what coalition governments always do, and we know they've got a bigger megaphone than us, and so it's something that we've got to address. But I think you just got to take the bull by the horns, and that's why we went out and said, like, campaigning so strongly to say, actually, we probably need a bit more tax if we're going to fund these services, because otherwise you're going to lose out on services. And just accepting that some people are then going to beat you about the head and say, well, that's exactly what you'd expect from the Greens, and say, yeah, well, that's right, let's have the discussion. If you know, I mean, one of the things that kind of got a bit missed in the last period of Parliament was Julia Gillard giving a speech where she talked about the Labor Party to an AWU conference and said, we are not a social democratic party. You know, she said, we are not a social democratic party, we are a Labor Party, whatever that means. And like, they have given up that space, and they will try, because Bill Shorten's not done, they will try and pick up bits of it in opposition, and this is the point that Lee is making, is that in opposition they're a very, very different beast, and we have to work out how to deal with that, given that we know that they won't then enact it when they're in Parliament. That's why I said that our first job has to be to say that we'll reverse some of the worst things that Abbott does, and then try and put Labor's feet to the fire and say, are you going to do the same, or are you just going to complain about it but then actually, you know, keep the cuts?
Thanks. Look, I think what some of these questions also raise is about Greens going into government, and the comment was made about doing deals with Labor. I think that warrants a comment, because we've had the recent experience of the Greens working with the federal Labor Party. Many people assumed we were in government. I didn't see it that way, but it was a real lesson for me. The number of Greens members also who assumed we were in government. I got the question, why haven't you worked the refugee issues out now you're in government? Then there's the experience in the ACT and Tasmania as well. That was interesting. We had a visit recently from one of the leaders. They have co-leaders of the Greens in New Zealand. And he spoke about how if they're going to go into government, that is a decision not just of the MPs, but they also have a party process as well, the party and the MPs, in working that out. So I think that that's something that we need to look at. But also, it's when do you go into government? And personally, I think this is something, as Greens, that we need to be very wary of. That doesn't mean that we may not be voting with Labor most of the time. I would expect we would be, as we do. When you're in Parliament, you look at the legislation, you judge if it's an improvement, that you can work with it. You probably will try and amend it a bit. If it's a write-off, you vote against it. But do you actually go into these agreements where often allowing Labor to survive at the end of their days, which is certainly how you can see it in Tasmania. So I think that there's a lot that we've really got to learn there, because it is a very complex relationship, how we work with Labor. Thanks.
If the Greens were being punished because we'd been supporting the Labor Party at the federal level, then one would have expected that one of the places where that would get played out the most was in my seat, because it was my seat that was necessary to support Labor, not the Senate, but my seat. And I didn't get punished. In fact, what we did was have a very clear ongoing discussion with the electorate that said, we are here and we want to get some good things, and we will try and stop Labor signing up with the Liberal Party agenda and Tony Abbott's agenda as much as we can, but we are there fighting, and I'm going to need your help, because at the moment there's one of us, and people responded well. People are up for that discussion, and I think yes, there's probably separate lessons to learn from from Tasmania and so on, but I think it would be an error to think that just because we somehow supported them in government, we got punished for that. I think it's more complicated.
The woman at the back who spoke about economic management, I mean, this is something Labor suffers from as well, not as severely as us, but the perception that they are good on this and that, but oh geez, you wouldn't put them in charge of a corner shop, much less the economy and so on and so forth. We get that in spades. So look, I think there's two answers to it. One is there's actually an argument we need to be developing, and it's something the Greens have done since its inception. I think it's getting better. I think the material that Adam had up on the overhead was a great example of just mounting a very consistent argument about how you would actually fund a modern welfare state in a capitalist economy through tax. It's not that rocket science, it's doable, we need to keep doing it. But I think it's a mistake to think that we're going to just simply win this through argument. I mean, if it was just a matter of argument to convince people to behave properly, we wouldn't have seen war, poverty. We'd have moved into some post-capitalist future a long time ago. There's other things which need to be done as well. And one of the things I think which really undermines these arguments about the economy is when we're involved in activity which stuffs it up. Think about the 98 MUA dispute. Part of the propaganda around that was they could not make money on the wharves if they allowed these corrupt union thugs with their fat cat sort of agreements and all the rest to have their conditions and so forth. Cargo's still moving in and out of Australian ports. There's still a profit being made. Nothing's really changed. Every little example like that, where you can sort of start to assert that there are different ways to approach these questions, I think that's how we start to prime the pump to really win those debates in the longer term. On Michael's point, super quickly, what parliamentarians do is a tactical question. They can stuff it up or they can get it right. I think the last federal parliament, tactically, I can understand how it went. I might have done things a bit differently, but I can see where it was at. Tasmania, not so much. But the key, if it's a tactical question because you understand that real power is outside of Parliament and what Parliament's doing is actually negotiating those realities, then it becomes a tactical question. If Parliament in and of itself is the point of your exercise, then I think you've got problems. And that's the real guts, I think, of what you're saying. And if that is what you're saying, I agree with you. But I think the real point for us is to understand that Parliament's vital as a part of the process of political change. It's what we're doing outside that sets those parameters.
Thanks. I went to a meeting at Ramsgate RSL last week, and Christine Milne spoke. Mark Butler and also Bill Shorten spoke, and the empty chair where the Liberal Party member for that area should have been was marked with his name. The audience was full of small business people in the solar industry, and it was conducted by the Solar Council. All was about the renewable energy target. But the MC distanced himself from Christine Milne. She was the last speaker. People in the audience were calling out, "When's Christine going to speak? Let her speak," all through. But I thought the main part of the audience was for that solar industry, and I wonder what the Greens do in terms of making links with business, small business and big business. Because I thought that they really effectively distanced Christine Milne, who took the big picture, who talked about global warming and the biggest thing and the clean energy finance and all of the bigger picture things to do with solar power. But the Labor Party just stuck to we're supporting small business. And I wonder what the Greens do in terms of creating the space where business trusts you.
I come from a National Party seat and I love this session because we haven't mentioned them once. It's not a bad government, it's a bad stoner government. And it's not an Abbott government, it's an Abbott Trust government. And we have Andrew Fraser, who's a Coffs Harbour National MP, getting on ABC radio and talking about those two parties, major parties that are responsible for the condition of our Native Vegetation Act. We let the National Party off the hook all the time, and we've got to start naming and shaming them as much as anyone else.
Thanks very much. John's raised it with before, and John, I have changed some of my media releases to say Liberal National, and it is a really important point. Look, I think the big lesson out of today and out of life is that the social movements have to be strong. As I said, I am actually passionate about Parliament as well as the Greens, but the social movements are what drives us. That's where Adam and I and our colleagues from Christine across the board, we are stronger in Parliament when the movement outside is so strong, so loud, really shaking the chains. Why I'm here as an MP is because our forebears fought for the right of women to vote and to have a place in Parliament. If I'd been born 100 years ago, I'd probably be a domestic. You know, that's what drives the social change. And yes, we work hard to get into Parliament, but we must never forget it, and we do need to rebuild our movements. To my mind, that is the most important thing.
The guts of it for mine is that it's understandable that because we are an electoral party that we focus on elections, but if we ever make the mistake of thinking that is what this is all about, then we might as well, I think, as I said in my introduction, change our name to the Democrats. What defines the Greens, I think, is that we are a party of progressive people looking at using Parliament as one space. But we have to always remember that space really, it's the icing on the sponge. It's meaningless unless you've got a cake underneath it. And that cake is society. What we do in society. Who was it? The politician who said that, Keating, change the government, you change society. Got it asked about, as you would expect a member of the right of the ALP to do. It's the other way around. We change society, we change governments. And it's not worth changing a government unless the social forces behind it have changed as well, because if that happens, you end up with a government with no authority, no capacity to act. Never forget this. We talk about Parliament because that's where we see power exercised. Most power is exercised well outside of Parliament. Most power is exercised in boardrooms. Most power is exercised by people who've never been elected, never will be elected, and act in their own interests. If we don't have movements capable of taking that on, then Parliament's nothing more than an interesting sideshow which we can play in for years, but the fundamentals will never change.
Whereas I think the social movements and the state of social forces in society at any given moment mark out the edges of the playing field within which Parliament makes its decisions. And unless there are strong social movements and social campaigns, then the decisions that are made are going to be much, much worse than they are at the moment. And you can even see that impacting on people like Clive Palmer. Who'd have thought Clive Palmer would think it's in his interest to stand up and say Tony Abbott is a bad man and I'm going to fight his GP co-payment all the way. That is happening because consistently in Melbourne there's been tens of thousands out on the streets every time that there's been a march in March or a march in August, and no, it's been the same here and around the country. I guess I would say to all of you, the ability for us to keep doing what we're doing is dependent on all of you and all the Greens members and supporters being shit-hot campaigners and communicators, really, because we can't do all the talking ourselves and we can't do all the persuading ourselves, and nothing changes someone's mind quite so much as someone who turns up and says on their doorstep and says, I'm a supporter, I'm a volunteer, I'm not getting paid to do this, but I'm here because I care about global warming, or I'm here because I care about the growing gap between rich and poor. That's what's making me come out on a cold night to come and door knock and talk to you. That changes people's minds, and that then means society starts to shift, and that then changes what politicians, including politicians in the other parties, do. And so really, you are in many ways more trustworthy communicators than us, because when we speak, people think, oh yeah, you're politicians, that's what we expect to hear from you, whereas when you speak and convince people, you can often actually convince people more than us. So thank you, that's your job, not to put too much pressure on you.